Herbert Bane. I'm presently on assignment in the Republic of Turkey. I'm the Chief of Fire Prevention and Technical Services at Incirlik Air Base, which is the guardian of all United States assets in the Republic of Turkey. Turkey is strategically located with neighbors such as Turkey and Syria to the south, Iran to the east, and Russia to the north. You can see that we must maintain surveillance over our neighbors at all times. One of the unique things about the base that I'm at right now is we have a combined task force. We are the element that enforces the no-flight zone over Iran. We're the ones that protect the Kurds at the border. We're the ones that maintain surveillance over the Black Sea and at the northern tip of where we enter Russia. I tell you this because here on this base, our base population, I pretty well blend into the population. Most people think that I'm just one of the other officers. Whenever I get an opportunity to talk to groups, two questions always come up. One is, where did I get my experience, and how do you go about getting a job working for the Air Force? Let's take them one at a time. Where did I get my experience? Well, that really goes back a few years, sometimes more than I care to really think about. But back in the 50s, let's talk about the 50s for a moment. I was a member of the Cincinnati Fire Department for 10 years. I joined the department in 1955. Now, some of you may have remembered me and some of you may have heard of me. But let me tell you some stories about how that came about. Back in the late 40s and the early 50s, there was an agreement made between the city and some of the black leadership of Cincinnati saying that if the right person, I don't know who that right person could have been, but if that right person came along as a prospective candidate, that they would be permitted to go into train on Cincinnati Fire Department. Now, they started that program in 1951, 1952. Now, as far as passing the examination to be a Cincinnati firefighter, that was very simple. And believe me, I know many people who passed that examination, but they didn't become Cincinnati firefighters. Because when they got to their background investigation, they were looking at things like a traffic citation that was perhaps 8 or 10 years old. They were looking at perhaps a blemish on their credit record. They were looking at things like tardiness or delinquency and truancy when they were in school. And these are frivolous things that in many instances are overlooked with the white counterpart, but when it came to a black recruit, they were actually screening them with a fine-tooth comb. Now, H.S. Bane, there was nothing extraordinary about him, but to show you how being at the right place at the right time pays off, I had just recently gotten out of the service in 1954. I had no intentions of going on the fire department because my goals had been to go in the police department. But I had not been out of service long enough to get a police record. That is the kind of police record that would keep you off of the fire department. So don't think that I was squeaky clean. It's just that I was fortunate and hadn't been out of service long enough to actually get in any trouble. And again, passing the examination was very simple. It was very meager. It was the simplest part of it. So I took the examination, And at the very last moment, I still had the choice of do I want to go in the police department or go in the fire department. And I was going to go on the police department because there was another candidate that had gone through the selection process along with me. And he was going to go on the fire department. And at the physical agility test, he had some problem with the curvature of the spine, and he was rejected. So once again, the Cincinnati black leadership asked me, would I be interested in the fire department? Well, again, I knew nothing of the fire service, but back in those days, the parity between the police department and fire department were the same. The privileges were the same, the pay was the same, the uniform was virtually the same. The unique feature of the fire service was they were about to go into a 56-hour work week, which was going to mean 24 hours on duty and 48 hours off duty. At that time, I was 21 years of age, and having that kind of time off was a prime attraction to me. So I took the examination, and this was going to be a unique class. Not only was it going to be unique because it was going to have the first black recruit in the class, but it was going to be one of the largest classes that they ever brought through the Cincinnati Fire College. We had 75 recruits, and it was the shortest class. It was only a 6-week class. The reason for having such a high number was they had to fill a lot of vacancies because the new hours were going to go into effect in April. We started the fire college on the 21st of February, 1955. We all had to be graduated and in place at fire stations by the 1st of April. So we kind of called ourselves the 6-week wonders. We graduated some pretty fine people out of that class. You might know Norm Wells, who later became your fire chief. He was in that class. Several of your assistant chiefs. Homeyer was your assistant chief. He was in the class. Your state fire marshal, he was in that class. The deputy chief of Los Angeles, he was in that class. So we had a rather unique class. And the fire college at that time was located down at Liberty and Lynn Street in the old engine company 2's house. And I remember reporting in there on the 21st of February with my little card in my hand saying to report to Louis Purcell, who was the drill master. And you got to remember now that most of us recruits down here at this fire college were all young kids in their early 20s. Most of us had just gotten out of the service. So most of them were used to being around blacks, and there was no big deal. We went to fire college. Fire college was sort of like a walk in the park to most of us. There was nothing difficult about it. And I never encountered any problems, racial problems of any sort while I was down there. Now, when I say I didn't encounter any racial problems, perhaps I'm a little more thick-skinned than other people. Now, as far as hearing the word nigger, I heard that word almost on a daily basis. But the word was not directed at me. It was towards blacks in general. When they would speak of responding companies down into black neighborhoods, it was referred to responding down with those niggers, or we saw those niggers and we rescued those niggers. But to my knowledge, none ever called me a nigger. They may have said it under their breath, but like I say, I was a young, reckless firefighter at that time. I wasn't that interested in pleasing the city. Had they spoken that word to me, I probably would have been discharged from the service right there for probably breaking somebody's jaw, but that never occurred. We graduated from fire college, and I was assigned to Engine Company 34 out at Clifton and Ludlow. Now, as I started this, I told you I spent 10 years in that fire department. Probably for the first 2 or 3 years, They were anything but pleasant. Now you got to remember, a lot of the firefighters back in those days, we had professional tailboardmen. We had men who had 25 and 30 years that barely had a 7th grade education, and they were hired to ride the back of the fire truck, and they were never going to be anything more than a tailboardman. They hired people that came from across the river. They came out of Vevey and Somerset, Kentucky, and every place point south, and I had a lot of problems, but they were not insurmountable problems. When we talk about problems, we had problems where in certain companies, now we had a 3-year probationary period back in those days. Now during that time, that meant that not only were you under the magnifying glass during those 3 years, but also you were not permanently assigned. That meant that during that 3-year period, every time someone was on vacation in your district, then you filled in for him. Every time someone was on leave, you filled in for him. So you spent a lot of time traveling throughout the district. Although the 34s is the station that I was assigned at, and I did spend most of my time there. But I can remember up in College Hill, the captain up there, you'd report for work, and he'd tell you, go out and check hydrants and don't come back till it gets dark. Again, that was no big problem for me. I had my own car. I was young. So I'd go out, check a district of hydrants, and not come back till it got dark. You go to places like out in Winton Place, and they say, you just stay in the house. We don't want you to ride the truck. Well, that really wasn't a big deal. You don't want me to ride the trucks, I won't ride the trucks. But where I think the big problem came from is the expectations that the black leadership had placed upon me. Now you got to remember that our whole perception of how we deal with racial issues today are considerably different than they were years ago. Years ago, it was turn the other cheek and wear that simple-minded smile on your face to let everybody know everything is going all right. And this is what I was expected to do, and that's what I did. And I think a lot of the problems that some of the blacks on the fire department are going through today is a result of that. This should have been brought out at the time. I encountered a great deal of resentment when I first got on the fire department. Now this resentment, I don't think was because I was black or other than being white. I think the resentment came because the notoriety that I received by being the only black on the fire department. We'd go out to some little fire that never amounted to anything, and there would be the newspaper men, the radio people from the different radio stations, news people, photographers, wanted to take a picture of me. They come into the fire station, wanted to take a picture of me. Now, I guess it's just normal envy or jealousy, but I would probably, if I was in that same boat as my white counterparts, I probably would resent it also. But when I talk about some of the bad things that happened to me on the fire department, the worst things that I think of in retrospect, looking back on it, is not so much the hostilities and the attitudes that I put up with the firefighters, but what the officers and district fire marshals permitted under their supervision. And these are the things that were unforgivable as I look at it. Now, when I say some of the officers and some of the fire marshals, I mean just what I say, some of them. There are some of them that were very good. There are some of them that are still alive that I keep in communication with even today. Some of the officers were very good. I still stay in contact with. But you got to remember also, it was a new experience for them, just like it was a new experience for me. It was a novelty, so to speak. And in later years, when I became a fire chief and I began to attend fire chief conferences, I began to talk to other people. Apparently, in several large cities throughout the United States, integrating fire departments began about the same time. So 20 or 25 years later, when I would talk to other fire chiefs, and some of those were black, we talked about the things that they encountered in their departments like Cleveland, in Phoenix, in St. Louis, Kansas City. And I suppose we all had the same agenda. I suppose their leadership was telling them the same thing as the black leadership was telling me in Cincinnati, that you must be passive. You must always keep that simple looking smile on your face like everything is going great. If anybody asks you, you should tell them that everything is fine, when things were anything but fine. And perhaps it goes back to turn the other cheek. Well, I suppose turn the other cheek is fine if you're the one doing slapping all the time. But if you're on the receiving end, turn the other cheek can wear out kind of quickly. But having said that, I also should tell you that you got to remember that when I went on the department, I was 21 years old. I was fresh out of the Marine Corps. I was fresh back from the Korean War. So the fire department really was just like eating pound cake to me. I mean, that was the simplest tour of duty that I'd ever been in. And I was, as far as my conduct and my attitude and my own personal deportment, it probably was anything but perfect. I hadn't been on the department more than less than 6 months, and I got a 10-day suspension. And that suspension wasn't caused because I was black, it was because I violated departmental rules. And just as I still have among my memoirs and my scrapbook, I still have the entrance postcard telling me that I had been accepted on the fire department, I still have my original suspension papers. But after I served that suspension, I said to myself that if I'm going to make this my life's work and I'm going to make this my career, then I'd better settle down and get with the program. So I began to study. And as you probably know, there's very little surprises in the fire department. The people who study are the people who generally get promoted. Those that are in the house with you, when their names come out on a promotional list, it generally doesn't surprise anyone because you're around them every day, you study with them, and you know what they know, and you know who knows what they know. I studied and I studied. I took lieutenant's exam after lieutenant's exam. The highest mark I ever got was 69. Now, several of those exams, everybody who got 70 got promoted. That means that before that list ran dead at the end of 2 years, everybody on that list who had gotten a passing grade got promoted. So after about 3 of them, I decided, well, it looks like I'm never going to get promoted. But strange things happen when you least suspect them. They were going to open up another ambulance service over in the old Nines house at Redding and Paddock. So now they're going to increase the size of the life squad. So I studied for that exam, and I failed it. And like I say, I couldn't understand why I failed it. And I went down. It's the first time I'd ever challenged civil service, and I talked it over with some of the black leadership in Cincinnati at the time. But the scores were in, the promotions were made, but as I said before, strange things have a way of happening. Only 2 people passed there were 4 vacancies. So they promoted those 2, and in 2 months they gave another exam. Well, maybe there's some truth to the crying baby gets the milk or the squeaking wheel gets the oil, because I certainly had done my share of crying over taking examinations. So I retook the exam and I got promoted. But I want to tell you, those 10 years I spent on the fire department were some of the best years of my life. Over the years since I have left the fire department, I have had an opportunity of serving with firemen from virtually all over the world in just about every major city in the United States. The Cincinnati Fire Department doesn't have to take a back seat to any of them as far as firemanship or firematics is concerned. Because back in the old days, there may have been some hard and some difficult supervisors to work for, but you learned the business. You learned firemanship. And I managed to learn even from some of those that I did not enjoy, and some of those that were very mean, very hard. But as I said before, that was only a few. Most of them were good people. And you look through the records and you look and you see names like Fire Marshal Warren. He's legendary in the fire department. Fire Marshal Telsher, Fire Marshal Avey, who later became the assistant chief. And these men, they were tough, but they were fair, and they were taskmasters. You worked for them, you learned the business. And I consider myself very fortunate to have been able to work for them. So, as I said, I spent 10 years on the fire department. I went on the department when I was 21. At the end of 10 years, I'm only 31. I took a look in the mirror one day and I saw a man that was virtually going nowhere. And I said, I've got to make my mind up. If I stay much longer, I have to stay forever. I've got 10 years now. 10 years may seem like a lot of years to throw away, but at least I was still a fairly young person. I was only 31 years of age. So I had already taken a federal civil service exam to go to the Pacific Missile Range as a fire captain. So I put in my resignation with no fanfare, just by the rule book. And back in those days, according to the rule book, you could put your resignation in conjunction with your vacation and submit them all at the same day. So the day that my resignation hit the chief's desk, that was my last day to work. So I didn't have to go around and do a lot of explaining why I'm going, where I'm going, and what ramifications that are going to follow. But I went down to the missile range, and I stayed there for a year. This is 1964. I stayed there from 64 to 65. And the Vietnam War was progressing pretty good then. So I got an offer from the State Department to go to Vietnam. At that time, the State Department was in charge of all firefighting resources in the Republic of Vietnam. Vietnam was broken down into 3 commands, and I went as an assistant chief of one of the commands, but before I got there, the command chief got killed. So I went, as I reported in as the command chief of one of the 3 districts. I had the district that covered Saigon. So I had Saigon, Tan Son Nhut. And if you think that making fire runs on some of your active companies, like the 32s or the 16s that are running 1,000 runs a year, multiply that times 3 or 4, and that's how many we would be running when we were in Vietnam. And there were no drill manuals. The only thing you had was your own resources, which you had learned someplace else. And we virtually wrote the book. So I stayed in Vietnam until the fall of Saigon in 1972. Then we went back to reclaim assets when the communists came in '75, and I transferred my retirement credits to the United Nations. As a fire expert for the United Nations, I served as fire chief in Singapore, in Damascus, Syria, in Mogadishu, Somalia, in Cairo, Egypt, in Rangoon, Burma, in Karachi, Pakistan, in Sana'a, North Yemen, in Aden, South Yemen, and in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. And if there's one thing I can say that will perhaps help you, is that if there's one bit of advice that I could perhaps give any of you firefighters, firefighting is a dangerous job just in itself. And let me tell you something. When you're at the fire ground and you're at the scene of an emergency, don't let some overzealous incident commander or an officer get you killed. Believe me, you get killed, nobody's going to shed any tears over you. Nobody's going to build a monument for you. And don't think the firemen are going to sit around in the stations and weep and cry for you. You only going to have to look out after yourself at the fire ground. Now, this is maybe one of the things they don't tell you. But, pal, over the years, I have broken the news to many widows and many mothers to tell them that their husbands or their sons have been killed at the fire ground. And many times, it was a needless death. You look after yourself. Don't let somebody let you get up on a roof that's wobbly. Don't let somebody get you in a building that's overloaded. Look out after yourself. Yes, those 10 years that I spent on the Cincinnati Fire Department, some of the happiest days of my life. I can remember that when we were working 1 day on and 2 days off, it was so much fun. I couldn't wait on like 2 days off to get back to work. And it was that much fun. You get in a good house with some good men, and like I say, it should be a law against having that much fun. And you may have heard some of the stories things that we've done. Now, some of the things that we've done as firefighters that we thought at the time was so funny, when you become a chief or you become a supervisor, some of those same things lose some of their hilarity when you've got to answer for them. But they were fun at the time. I don't know if they still keep pistols in the fire station or not, but back in the old days, we used to have pistols in the fire station. And once a week, you take the pistols out, and you take all the bullets out and polish the bullets and clean the mold off of the leather and clean the mold off the holsters. And of course, while the guns were out, everybody would strap the gun on and play quick draw with one another. So here's old Cookie standing back at the sink. He's making lunch, and the officer is a guy we used to call Shaky. We shouldn't have made fun of him. I think he had Parkinson's disease or something, but he used to shake all the time. So he's telling the guys, put the guns away before you kill somebody. And everybody's got the gun on and they're snap drawing. So another guy is standing with a paper bag and he's blowing it up. So the guy is standing back by the sink. He takes a tomato, holds it in his hand. The guy with the paper bag pops it, and he yells at the same time, "Don't point that gun at me." And you hear the pow, and the guy takes the tomato and slams it up against his chest, and you see all that red stuff run between his fingers. Well, old Shaky fell out on the floor in a dead faint. He just knew that somebody had been killed. Every man on the floor got 1 day suspension. And when the chief came, he took one look at me and he said, "Hey, Herb," he said, "I'm going to spare you because you just came off a suspension. If I have to suspend you again, I'll fire you." So it was kind of funny back in the old days. You know, you might hear stories about the resentment But after we got over the novelty, we had a pretty good bunch of guys. And like I say, I still keep in contact with a bunch of them. And it was a sheer pleasure. Those 10 years were good years. I learned a lot. I benefited from it. And nobody had to be ashamed of being a member of the Cincinnati Fire Department. Thank you.